The void between stars erupted into chaos as Scourge weapons tore through space toward the Volani Royal Fleet Admiral. Park commanded his escort vessels with desperate precision, throwing everything they had at the machine nightmares that had returned from extinction. Shields failing on the outer perimeter, the tactical officer reported. "We cannot hold this position much longer." Suriel watched the battle unfold on the view screen and felt the weight of every life that was being lost to protect Earth. Morath had already fled with 3 vessels, abandoning his queen to the fate he had suggested she surrender to. "Your Majesty, you should evacuate to the escape pod," Park urged. "We can buy you time to reach the nearest inhabited system." "I am not leaving," Suriel replied firmly. "I spent 30 years hiding from the truth, and I will not spend another moment hiding from anything." The communication panel suddenly lit up with incoming signals from directions the Scourge had not anticipated. Multiple contacts approaching from hyperspace, the sensor officer announced with disbelief in her voice. Human signatures. Dozens of them. Ships began emerging from the light of faster-than-light travel. Human warships and cargo vessels and civilian craft that had no business being in a combat zone. They came from Earth and from Mars and from the mining colonies of the asteroid belt and from every corner of human. Space Orcs broadcast had reached them, and they had answered with everything they had. "This is Captain Chen Wei of the Earth Defense Fleet," a voice announced over the communication channel. "We heard your message, Your Majesty, and we remember Captain Yun." More voices joined the channel. Ship captains and pilots and ordinary citizens who had loaded weapons onto their personal vessels and flown into danger. "We remember Keth 4, they said. "We remember what he did. We remember." The human fleet crashed into the Scourge formation like a wave of righteous fury that had been building for 30 years. They were not soldiers fighting for territory or resources. They were people honoring a debt that had never been. Acknowledged Admiral Park stared at the view screen with tears streaming down his face as he watched his species rise to defend a queen who had finally spoken the truth. "All vessels coordinate with human forces," he commanded. "Show them what happens when our peoples fight together." The battle lasted for hours, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. After the humans arrived, the Scourge were ancient and powerful, but they had never faced an enemy who fought not for survival but for something they believed in. When the last machine ship exploded in a cascade of sparks and debris, a cheer erupted across both fleets that echoed through the cosmos. Suriel stood on the bridge of her damaged vessel and looked at the human ships that surrounded her like a protective embrace. "Your Majesty," Park said quietly, "we should continue to Earth. The ceremony can still proceed as planned." She nodded slowly and felt something shift in her heart, a weight lifting that she had carried since childhood. The journey to Earth took another day, and the human fleet escorted her the entire way like an honor guard that had been waiting 3 decades to perform its due. New soul gleamed beneath them as the royal transport descended toward the memorial plaza where thousands of humans had gathered to witness something unprecedented. Shuri walked down the landing ramp in her ceremonial robes with Admiral Park at her side, and Jihei following close behind. The crowd parted before her, and she saw the monument she had come so far to find. It was a simple wall of black stone carved with thousands of names. Humans who had died in service during the Scourge War and the conflicts that preceded it. Captain Yun Deho's name was there among the others, no larger or more prominent than the soldiers and relief workers who had fallen beside him. Media drones hovered overhead, and she knew that billions of beings across the galaxy were watching this moment. She walked to the wall and found his name with fingers that trembled. Despite her attempt to remain composed 30 years ago, this man saved my life. she announced in a voice that carried across the plaza and beyond. He did not know I was a princess. He did not care about politics or species or the ancient grudges between our peoples. She turned to face the crowd and saw human faces looking back at her with expressions of hope and wonder. He saved me because I was a child who needed help, she continued. And that simple truth was too much for my people to accept. She spoke the words that Vellani queens were never supposed to speak. Words of apology and gratitude and acknowledgement of debt. We were wrong, she declared. We were wrong to hide what he did, wrong to pretend that our pride was more important than his sacrifice. Admiral Park stepped forward and stood beside her as she turned back to face the monument. The Vellani have a ritual for debts that can never be repaid. Suriel explained. It is called the life bond, and it ties one bloodline to another for all generations to come. She lowered herself to her knees before the monument and pressed her forehead against the cold stone where his name was carved. The crowd gasped and murmured because no Vellani royal had ever knelt before anyone, let alone before the memorial of another specieshuril. Spoke the ancient words of the life bond in her own language and then translated them so everyone could understand. My blood remembers your blood, she said. My life exists because your life ended, from this day until the stars grow cold. My house belongs to your house. She remained on her knees and let the tears come as she whispered words meant only for him. You told me I would be okay, she said softly. I am okay. I survived, and I grew. I became someone who could change things. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. I became someone who could finally tell the truth. And I hope wherever you are, I hope you can hear me saying thank you. Admiral Park knelt beside her without ceremony or protocol. Not as a soldier following orders, but as family honoring family. He unpinned the medal from his uniform and placed it at the base of the monument where it caught the light of the setting sun. Uncle, he said quietly, your medal came home. Suriel reached out and took his hand without thinking about what it meant or how it looked to the cameras watching them. Human and Vellani, soldier and queen, bound together by a sacrifice that had echoed across 30 years of silence. The crowd began to kneel as well. Humans lowering themselves in respect, not for the queen, but for the captain who had taught them all what courage really meant. Jihai stood behind them with tears streaming down her face. Finally seeing the moment she had waited half her life to witness, the sun set over New Seoul and painted the sky in colors that reminded Suriel of a distant explosion that had once marked the end of everything and the beginning of everything. Elsie looked at the name carved in stone and made one final promise. I will make sure they remember, she said. I will make sure everyone knows what one human did when the darkness came and all hope seemed lost. She rose to her feet and helped Admiral Park rise beside her, and together they faced the future that Captain Yoon Daeho had purchased with his life. The galaxy watched a queen who had knelt before a hero and finally understood what humans had always known: some debts can never be repaid. They can only be honored with the rest of your days, and sometimes that is enough. 30 years had passed since the flames of Keth IV, and the child who survived had become a queen who remembered Queen Suriel Kethvaner stood in the great throne room of Ethis Prime as thousands of Vellani nobles watched her coronation with expressions ranging from hope to barely concealed hostility. Her grandmother had died 3 months ago after a long illness that had given Suriel time to prepare for this moment. The ancient crown settled onto her head like a weight that she had been carrying her entire life, and the assembled nobles knelt in acknowledgement of her new authority. Rise, she commanded. I have an announcement that cannot wait. High Counselor Tithmorith stood at the front of the noble assembly with his silver eyes narrowed in suspicion because he had opposed her claim to the throne from the beginning. Your Majesty, he said smoothly. Perhaps such announcements should wait until after the traditional ceremonies have concluded. The traditions can wait, Suriel replied. What I have to say has waited long enough already. She descended from the throne and walked among her people with a confidence that made the older nobles shift uncomfortably in their ceremonial robes in 1 month. I will make a state visit to Earth, she announced. The first such visit by any Vellani monarch in the history of our peoples. Gasps echoed through the throne room, and Tith Morath's face twisted with barely contained outrage. Your Majesty, this is unprecedented, he protested. The humans are a primitive species unworthy of such honor. The humans, Suriel replied calmly, saved my life when I was a child on Keth 4. Silence fell over the assembly like a blanket of snow covering a battlefield. The official records state that Vellani soldiers extracted you from the colony, Tith Morath said carefully. The official records are lies, Suriel replied. Lies that my grandmother ordered to protect. Vellani pried at the expense of truth and honor. She told them the story that she had pieced together over 15 years of secret research. The story of a human captain who gave his life for 3 Vellani children. He had never met. She told them about the escape pod and the recording and the systematic cover-up. That had erased a hero from history. Many of the younger nobles listened with expressions of shock and shame. But Tith Morath and his faction remained unmoved. Even if this story is true, he said dismissively, one human's death changes nothing about the fundamental nature of their species. One human's death changed everything about my life, Suriel countered. And I intend to honor that debt whether you approve or not. The preparations for the state visit consumed the following weeks as Suriel worked with her staff to plan every detail. Of the journey, she appointed Ambassador Quan Jihei as her official liaison with Earth's government. And together, they crafted a ceremony that would finally give Captain Yoon Dae-ho the recognition he deserved. Admiral Park Min-jun arrived at Ethos Prime 2 weeks before the scheduled departure to serve as the military commander of her escort fleet. He was a stern man in his late 40s, with eyes that reminded Suriel of someone she had known long ago in a burning colony on a distant world. Admiral Park, she said during their first meeting. I understand that you have a personal connection to the purpose of this visit. Park stood at attention with military precision, but his composure flickered briefly at her words. Captain Yoon Dae-ho was my uncle. Your Majesty, he confirmed. My mother's brother, though I never met him. He died before I was born. He reached into his uniform and pulled out a small medal on a faded ribbon that looked like it had been treasured for decades. This was awarded to him posthumously for actions during the Keth 4 evacuation. Park explained. My grandmother kept it until she died, and then my mother passed it to me. Suriel looked at the medal and felt the weight of 30 years pressing down on her shoulders. He saved my life, she said softly, and I never had the chance to thank him. Park's stern expression softened slightly as he met her silver eyes. He would not have expected thanks. Your Majesty, he replied, from what my mother told me. He believed that helping others was simply what humans were supposed to do. The journey to Earth took 3 weeks through hyperspace lanes that had rarely seen. Vellani royal vessel Suriel spent the time reviewing the ceremony plans and speaking with Jihei about the changes that had occurred on Earth since the war ended. She also found herself seeking out Admiral Park's company more often than protocol required. There was something comforting about being near someone who carried the same burden of memory that she had borne alone for so long. They were 2 days from Earth when the alarms began screaming throughout the fleet. Scourge signatures detected, the sensor officer reported with fear evident in her voice. Multiple contacts emerging from dark space. Suriel rushed to the bridge where Admiral Park was already issuing orders to the escort vessels. "This is impossible," he muttered. "The Scourge were destroyed 20 years ago. Apparently not all of them," Suriel replied as the view screen filled with the nightmare shapes of Scourge warships emerging from the darkness between stars. There were dozens of them. More than enough to overwhelm her small escort fleet. "They are targeting the royal vessel specifically," the tactical officer reported. "Their approach pattern suggests they know exactly who's aboard." Park turned to Suriel with grim understanding in his eyes. "They remember Keth IV," he said quietly. "They tracked your bloodline, and they have been waiting for an opportunity like this. The Scourge have been humiliated by a single human ship 30 years ago, and now they wanted revenge against the child that ship had died to protect. Can we outrun them?" Suriel asked. "No, Your Majesty," Park replied honestly. "They have cut off our escape routes." Tithmorth's voice crackled over the communication system from his vessel at the rear of the fleet. "Your Majesty, this is the consequence of your foolish diplomacy," he said with satisfaction barely hidden beneath his concern. "If we surrender you to the Scourge, they may allow the rest of the fleet to withdraw. You would hand your queen to the machines?" Park demanded with outrage. "I would preserve our people," Tithmorth replied. "Something our new queen seems incapable of considering." Suriel walked to the communication panel and opened a channel that would broadcast to every ship in her fleet and beyond. "This is Queen Suriel Kethvaner of the Vallani Concord," she announced. "I am requesting immediate assistance from any vessels in range." She paused and took a breath before speaking the words that would change everything. 30 years ago, a human captain named Yundeho gave his life to save mine, she continued. "My people covered up his sacrifice because they were too proud to admit that we owed a debt to humanity." Her voice grew stronger as she shed the lies that had suffocated the truth for 3 decades. "I am done being proud," she declared. "I am asking for help, not as a queen demanding service, but as a woman who was once a frightened child saved by human kindness." The broadcast went out across all frequencies, reaching Earth and every human colony and station between the stars. Admiral Park stood beside her and watched the Scourge fleet approaching with weapons charged. That was either very brave or very foolish. "Your Majesty," he said quietly. Suriel looked at the medal he still wore pinned to his uniform. The medal that had waited 30 years to find its meaning. "Your uncle taught me that sometimes there is no difference between the two," she replied. The first Scourge weapons began firing, and the battle for survival commenced. 15 years had passed since the burning sky of Keth IV, and the little girl who clutched a pendant had grown into a woman who carried the weight of secrets and memories. Princess Suriel Kethvaner stood in the grand archives of the Vallani throne world and stared at the official record of her rescue with anger building behind her silver eyes. The document spoke of heroic Vallani soldiers who had extracted the young princess from the doomed colony and transported her safely to the royal fleet. There was no mention of a human ship or a human captain or a sacrifice that had haunted her dreams for a decade and a half. "This is a lie," she said quietly to the empty room. "All of it is a lie." Her grandmother, Queen Mother Ileana, had always dismissed her fragmented childhood memories as trauma-induced fantasies that held no connection to reality. But Suriel knew what she had seen, and she knew what she had felt when those warm human hands lifted her from the rubble. She had spent years secretly gathering information through channels that a princess was not supposed to access, bribing servants and hacking into restricted databases. The truth was scattered across dozens of class files that painted a picture very different from the official story her people had been told. Captain Yundeho of the Earth Relief Corps had died destroying a Scourge harvester unit after launching an escape pod containing 3 Vallani children. The Vallani military had recovered the pod and the children, but had immediately classified all records relating to human involvement in the rescue commander Thesa Velern. Now, a decorated admiral, had personally overseen the suppression of any evidence that might suggest humans had played a role in saving the royal bloodline. Juriel walked through the gleaming corridors of the palace toward her grandmother's private chambers with a determination that frightened even herself. The Queen Mother was ancient by Villani standards. Her violet skin faded to pale lavender, and her silver eyes clouded with age and suspicion. "Grandmother, I need to speak with you about HFY," Suriel said, as she entered the chamber without waiting for permission. Ilyana looked up from her meditation cushion with an expression that mixed annoyance with something that might have been fear. "We have discussed this matter before," she replied coldly. "Your memories of that time are unreliable, and dwelling on them serves no purpose." "Then explain this," Suriel demanded, holding up a data tablet that displayed the recovered flight logs from an Earth Relief Corps vessel. The Queen Mother's eyes widened briefly before her face settled back into its mask of royal composure. "Where did you obtain that information?" she asked in a voice that could freeze starlight. "It does not matter where I obtained it," Suriel replied. "What matters is that it proves everything you told me was false." She stepped closer to her grandmother and felt the anger of 15 years rising in her chest like a storm that had been waiting too long to break. "A human saved my life," she continued. "A human gave everything he had so that I could live, and you erased him from history like he never existed." Ilyana rose from her cushion with dignity that age had not diminished and met her granddaughter's gaze without flinching. "That human was irrelevant," she said dismissively. "His sacrifice, if it occurred as you believe, was merely the action of a primitive species following its basic instincts." Suriel felt like she had been struck across the face by the casual cruelty of those words. "He was a person," she said quietly. "He had a name and a life and people who loved him, and he gave all of that up for a child he had never met. He gave it up for a Villani princess," Ilyana corrected, "which means his death served the Concord, whether he intended it or not." "He did not know I was a princess," Suriel replied. "He saved me because I was a frightened child hiding under rubble, because he believed that every life had value, regardless of species or status." The Queen Mother turned away and gazed out the window at the beautiful gardens that surrounded the palace like a promise of eternal peace. "You speak of human philosophy as though it has merit," she said with contempt dripping from every word. "But you forget that these creatures nearly destroyed themselves with their primitive wars before they even reached the stars. And yet one of them did what none of our soldiers would do," Suriel countered. "He stayed behind to die so that Villani children could live." She left her grandmother's chamber without waiting for a response and made her way to the diplomatic wing of the palace where foreign ambassadors maintained their offices. Ambassador Quan Jihei had served as Earth's representative to the Villani Concord for 5 years, and she had always seemed strangely interested in the young princess, who avoided most diplomatic functions. Suriel found her in a modest office that was decorated with images of Earth and small artifacts from human culture. "Princess Suriel," Jihei said with surprise as she rose from her desk. "This is unexpected. How may I serve you?" Suriel closed the door behind her and locked it before turning to face the human woman who had aged gracefully into her 50s. "You were there," Suriel said simply. "At HFY, you were the lieutenant who served under Captain Yoon." Jihai's face went pale, and her hands trembled as she sank back into her chair like someone who had just received news of a death. "How do you know that name?" she whispered. "Because I remember him," Suriel replied. "I was the girl in the escape pod, the one he saved." Tears began flowing down Jihai's cheeks, and she made no effort to hide them or wipe them away. "We thought you were dead," she said brokenly, when the Villani refused to confirm whether the children survived. "We assumed the worst." She reached into her desk and pulled out a small device that looked like it had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. He recorded a message before he launched the pod. Jihei explained. I recovered it from the ship's backup systems before we abandoned the auxiliary craft. She handed the device to Suriel with hands that shook with emotion too long suppressed. I have been waiting to give this to someone who would understand what it meant. Jihei continued. I think he would want you to have it. Suriel activated the device and heard a voice she had not heard since childhood. A warm human voice that wrapped around her heart like an embrace from the past. Please tell the smallest one. The girl with the pendant. Please tell her that she's going to be okay. She stood in the ambassador's office and let the tears come as the voice of Captain Yoon Daeho echoed through the empty years. He had not asked for glory or recognition or even acknowledgement of his sacrifice. He had only wanted her to know that everything would be okay, and in that moment, Princess Suriel Kethvaner made a decision that would change the course of two civilizations. She would make sure the galaxy remembered his name, even if she had to tear down every lie her people had built to hide. A message arrived on Jihai's communication panel informing them that Queen Mother Ileana had collapsed and was being rushed to the medical wing. The doctors were not optimistic, and the council was already preparing for a transition of power. Suriel looked at the recording device in her hand and then at the human ambassador who had carried this burden alone for so long. When I'm queen, she said quietly, everything is going to change. Jihei nodded, and for the first time in 15 years allowed herself to hope that her captain's sacrifice had not been in vain. The ship groaned like a wounded animal as Daeho carried Suri through the smoke-filled corridors toward the medical bay where he had ordered all survivors to gather. Jihei met him at the door with a face that told him everything he needed to know before. She even spoke the words, the main engines are gone, she reported, her voice cracking under the weight of what that meant. We have maneuvering thrusters and one escape pod that somehow survived the debris strike. Daeho set Suri down gently and looked around the medical bay where frightened faces stared back at him with hope he was not sure he could justify. There were 12 Vellani civilians who had made it aboard before the loading ramp was damaged, including 2 other children about the same age as Suri. His own crew of 8 humans stood ready for whatever orders he would give them because they trusted him with their lives even when he was about to ask for the impossible. One escape pod, he repeated slowly. What is its capacity? Jihai's eyes glistened with tears. She was too professional to let fall in front of the others. 1 adult, she said quietly, or 2 small children, if we remove the secondary life support module and trust the primary system to hold. Daeho looked at the 3 Vellani children huddled together in the corner of the medical bay, their silver eyes wide with terror and confusion. Suri was holding hands with the other 2, a boy and a girl who looked like they might be siblings, and she was whispering to them in soft Vellani words that Daeho could not quite hear. He knelt down in front of them and smiled even though his heart was breaking into pieces that he knew would never fit back together. I need you 3 to be very brave, he said in their language. Can you do that for me? Suri nodded solemnly, and the other 2 copied her movement because children always follow the one who shows the least fear. You are going to take a little trip in a special pod, Daeho continued. It will take you to a big ship where your people will keep you safe. The boy, who looked to be about 9 years old, tilted his head with suspicion that was heartbreaking in one so young. What about you? He asked. What about the others? Daeho reached out and gently touched the pendant that still hung around Suri's neck, the mysterious symbol glowing softly in the dim emergency lighting. We will find another way. He lied with all the conviction he could muster. But you 3 need to go first because you are the most important cargo on this ship. Jihei grabbed his arm and pulled him aside with a grip that was stronger than he expected from her small frame. Captain, you cannot do this, she hissed urgently. There has to be another option. There has to be something we have not considered. Daeho placed his hands on their shoulders and looked into the eyes of the woman who had served beside him for 7 years, through battles and rescues and moments of joy and sorrow. Jihei, I need you to listen to me very carefully, he said calmly. You are going to put those children in the escape pod, and you are going to program it to intercept the nearest Vellani cruiser. She shook her head violently, and tears finally escaped down her cheeks. And then what? She demanded, what happens to the rest of us? What happens to you? He glanced at the main viewport where the Scourge Harvester was visible in the distance, its massive form illuminated by the fires it had created. I'm going to fly this ship directly at that thing, he said simply. The reactor is damaged, but it still has enough power for one final explosion. That is suicide. Jihei whispered. That is a chance. Daeho corrected her. A chance for those children, and a chance for everyone else to escape while the Scourge are focused on me. The next hour was the longest of his life as he helped load the 3 children into the cramped escape pod and made sure their restraints were secure as Suri. Watched him with those silver eyes that seemed to see right through to his soul and understand things that a 7-year-old should never have to. Understand, you are not coming with us, she said quietly. And it was not a question. Dale brushed a strand of violet hair from her small face and memorized every detail, so that he would have something beautiful to hold on to in whatever came next. I have to stay and fly the ship, he explained gently. But I need you to do something very important for me. What? She asked, her voice trembling. I need you to grow up strong and kind, he said. I need you to remember that humans are not your enemies, that we can be your friends if you give us the chance. She reached out and touched his face with tiny fingers that were soft and warm against his weathered skin. I will remember you, she promised solemnly. I will remember you forever. Daeho smiled and pressed a kiss to her forehead before stepping back and, sealing the pod door between them, he moved to the small recording station near the pod controls and activated the message system that would attach his words to the pod's data core. My name is Captain Yoon Daeho of the Earth Relief Corps, he began, his voice steady despite everything. This pod contains 3 Vellani children who I found during the evacuation of Keth 4. He paused and looked at the small window of the pod where Suri's face was pressed against the glass. I do not know who will receive this message or if anyone will even care what happened here today, he continued. But I am asking, as one living being to another, please take care of these children. His voice finally cracked as he spoke his final words. Please tell the smallest one, the girl with the pendant, please tell her that she is going to be okay. He launched the pod and watched it streak away into the darkness toward the distant lights of the Vellani cruiser that was preparing to jump to safety. Then he turned to Jihei and his remaining crew, who had refused to abandon him despite his orders. Get to the auxiliary craft, he commanded. It is damaged, but it might hold together long enough to reach the cruiser's wake. We are not leaving you, Jihei said stubbornly. That is an order. Lieutenant, Daeho replied with a firmness that left no room for argument. Someone needs to survive to tell the truth about what happened here. He pushed her toward the door and watched his crew file out one by one until he was alone on the bridge of his dying ship. Through the viewport he could see the escape pod approaching the Vellani cruiser. Could see the moment when the cruiser's tractor beam caught it and pulled it to safety. Suri was going to live, and that was enough. He pointed his ship at the Scourge Harvester and pushed the damaged engines to their absolute limit as alarms screamed warnings. He no longer cared about the Harvester, turned its weapons toward him, but it was too slow. Too confident in its mechanical superiority, Captain Yoon Daeho smiled as his ship collided with the Nightmare, and the reactor exploded with the force of a small sun in the escape pod. Suri pressed her face against the window and watched the distant flash of light that painted the darkness with colors she had no words to describe. She did not understand death yet. Not really, but she understood that the kind human with the warm voice was gone. Her small hand closed around her pendant and her heart made a soye. Promised that her mind would spend the next 30 years learning how to keep. She would remember him. She would remember him forever. The sky above Kethfor burned orange and black as Scourge warships descended through the atmosphere like metal locusts hungry for destruction. Captain Yundeho gripped the controls of his relief vessel and watched the chaos unfold below him with a heavy heart that had seen too many colonies fall to these machines. Captain, we need to turn back, Lieutenant Quan Jihei said from beside him, her voice tight with fear she was trying to hide. This was supposed to be a supply run, not a combat mission. Deho shook his head slowly and pointed toward the colony where thousands of Villani civilians were running through the streets like frightened animals seeking shelter that did not exist. There are children down there, he said quietly. We did not come all this way to watch them die. The Villani were a proud species with violet skin and large, silver eyes that reflected light like mirrors in the darkness. And they had never been friendly toward humans, despite sharing the same enemies. And this terrible war commander Thissa Velern appeared on his communication screen with her sharp features twisted in what Deho had learned to recognize as Villani contempt. Human vessel, you will withdraw immediately, she commanded in her cold voice that carried no warmth or gratitude. This is a Villani matter, and we do not require your primitive assistance. Deho ignored her dismissal and began landing procedures. Anyway, because he had learned long ago that pride meant nothing when innocents were dying. With respect, Commander, my ship carries medical supplies and emergency rations that your people need right now, he replied calmly. You can hate us later when everyone is safe. The colony was a mining settlement built into the rocky terrain of this border world, and the Scourge had chosen it specifically because it was far from any major Villani military presence. Deho landed his ship near the central evacuation point where Villani soldiers were desperately trying to organize the panicked crowds into some kind of order. He grabbed his emergency kit and stepped out into a air that smelled like smoke and fear, and the strange metallic scent that always followed the Scourge wherever they spread their destruction. Jihei, start unloading the medical supplies, he ordered over his shoulder. I am going to help with the evacuation. She wanted to argue with him because she always wanted to argue when he put himself in danger. But she knew better than to waste precious time with words that would change nothing. He moved through the crowds of terrified Villani who looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to open hostility because many of them had never seen a human before. He helped where he could, carrying injured civilians toward the medical tents and guiding lost children back to their families while explosions rocked the ground beneath his feet. The Scourge were getting closer, and their horrible mechanical sounds filled the air like the screaming of demons from some ancient nightmare. It was near a collapsed building that he heard the small voice crying out in the Villani language that he had studied. During his years of service in this region of space, he pushed aside rubble with his bare hands until his fingers bled and his muscles screamed for rest that he refused to give. Then beneath a fallen beam he found her, a tiny Villani girl, no more than 7 years old, with violet skin covered in dust and silver eyes filled with tears that caught the light of distant fires. It is okay, he said softly in her language, his accent terrible, but his meaning clear. I am going to get you out of here. She clutched something against her chest as he carefully lifted her from the wreckage. A small pendant on a delicate chain that glowed faintly with inner light. Deha did not recognize the symbol carved into the pendant, but he Noticed how the girl held it like it was the most precious thing in the universe. "What is your name, little one?" he asked as he carried her toward the evacuation zone. "Sorry," she whispered, her small arms wrapping around his neck with desperate strength. He held her tighter and made a promise to himself that he would see her safely onto one of the evacuation ships no matter what it cost him. Commander Valar intercepted him near the landing pads where Vellani cruisers were loading refugees as fast as their systems would allow. "Human, put that child down immediately," she demanded. "She will be evacuated with her own kind, not contaminated by your touch." Deho felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady for the sake of the frightened girl in his arms. "She is scared, and she has been through something terrible," he said firmly. "Right now she needs kindness, not protocols." Valen's silver eyes narrowed with ancient prejudice that humans had faced from the Vellani since the two species first made contact decades ago. "Your kind carries diseases that could spread through our population," she said coldly. "This is not cruelty. It is simple biological reality." It was a lie and they both knew it. But Deho had learned that arguing with Vellani pride was like arguing with a stone wall that had been standing for 1,000 years. A massive explosion shook the ground and sent both of them stumbling as a scourge harvester unit breached the northern perimeter of the colony. The harvester was enormous, a walking nightmare of metal and malice that towered over the buildings and began systematically destroying everything in its path. "The evacuation window is closing," Jihei shouted through his communicator. "Captain, we need to leave now." Deho looked at the chaos around him and then down at the small face of Suri, who was watching him with those enormous silver eyes that held more trust than he deserved. The Vellani ships were already lifting off one by one, their hatches sealed against any human who might try to board them. His own ship was damaged from debris that had struck it during landing, and Jihei was reporting that the engines were failing and the hull was compromised in 3 places. "How many people can we take?" he asked quietly. "Maybe 20 if we push the life support to maximum," Jihei replied. "But Captain, we might not make it out of atmosphere with this damage." He made his decision in that moment. The kind of decision that separates ordinary men from those who become legends. "Remember to cross the stars. Start loading civilians," he ordered. "Take anyone you can fit, Vellani or human. It does not matter." Valen stared at him with something that might have been surprise or might have been the first crack in her wall of contempt. "You would risk your own people to save mine?" She asked. Deho shifted Suri in his arms and met the commander's gaze without flinching. "I would risk everything to save anyone," he said simply. "That is what humans do." The Scourge Harvester was getting closer now, and its weapons were charging with that terrible hum that preceded death and destruction. Suri buried her face against his shoulder, and her small body trembled with fear that no child should ever have to feel. Deha held her close and whispered words of comfort that he was not sure he believed himself. "You are going to be okay," he promised her. "I will make sure of it." He did not know then that those words would echo across 30 years of history and change the fate of 2 civilizations forever. All he knew was that there was a child who needed protection and a duty that demanded everything he had to give. The evacuation window was closing, and the Scourge were coming, and somewhere in the burning night a choice was waiting to be made, a choice that would cost him everything and give the universe something it would never forget.